Welcome back, everyone. I'm Tom Laney. I'm the director of the McFarland Center for Religion, Ethics, and Culture. And for those of you who have been here for, at least if you're sophomores, through COVID, this is a sort of event that we used to do fairly often. And I was just saying this is the first time we've actually been back in person to do. So to do a fishbowl discussion as a format is something we had done a great deal of at Holy Cross. And many of you have seen versions of those, I guess, online in unwieldy Zoom rooms. So it's nice to be back in person doing something. Maybe we'll see if this may be an unwieldy crowd anyway, but we'll see what we can do about this here. So I'm pleased to be working with Kathy Leibowitz. Kathy was here from Sustainability Office, who helped us think about all this and put it together. And if you haven't been to a fishbowl discussion, we're the fish. You're in the middle of it, and we're going to really discuss for a little while some of those issues, and it's supposed to be different from a panel. People won't talk as long, so it's meant to be more of a conversation, and we'll give you a chance eventually to step in and add things. They may ask you some questions, so be prepared. You may have some points, and it won't be as if like a panel that everyone comes back and answers the question that we're looking at. This is being recorded. It'll be online sometime soon enough via YouTube, the Holy Cross site. So if you do ask a question, you can tell your mom or something. She's going to see you on TV, but or on whatever, not TV. You can tell my age on YouTube. But just so people know if they do ask questions, that if that's where it's going to end up. I'd say that the impetus for thinking about this is, as we talked with Kathy and I talked about environment and ethics. I suppose it's sometimes easy to look at environmental questions and think of them in terms of sort of the good activists versus the bad polluters, people throwing carbon into the atmosphere, and some simplistic good and bad ethical issues. But we also wanted a way to explore ways that decisions that get made around climate happen where values are traded off, where there are people who have to look at how you incorporate the needs of many people, how they weigh against one another, and that they're real ethical decisions that are part of that. And ethics always involve trade-offs. They're just not, don't do a bad thing, but they involve trade-offs that people have to make. So we want to take some time to look at them and perhaps look at the ways that some of the things we've done for environmental work has perhaps unintentionally had different impacts on poor people or well-off people, whoever is behind doing those. So if we look at how we create that as a city. We're going to look at, do this by looking at means of looking at Worcester's Green Worcester plan, which aims to create a coordinated approach among the city departments to achieve sustainability goals and enhance climate resilience. So in that sense, we have a particular document that we're looking at that was achieved, but we're looking also and thinking about the issues more broadly than that. So we have the three fish I just want to introduce. I'm grateful to them for joining me in the process. And the first is John Fernández. John is a professor of building technology in the Department of Architecture at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, MIT, and director of the Environmental Environmental Solutions Initiative. ESI is an institute-wide effort at MIT to mobilize the substantial benefit, engineering, policy, and design capacity at MIT to contribute to addressing climate change and other environmental issues globally. Professor Fernández is a founder and director of MIT's Urban Metabolism Group and a member of Climate Nucleus charged with managing and implementing MIT's Climate Action Plan. Karin Valentine Goins is program director of Preventative and Behavioral Medicine at University of Massachusetts Medical School, a public health activist who has worked for nearly 20 years at state and local levels to understand and improve walking and bicycle conditions. Her research at the intersection of health and transportation includes developing standards that local health departments can use in their strategic planning to increase the participation in local transportation and land use policy. She co-founded WalkBike Worcester and served as a member of the Green Worcester Working Group. So some expertise on the particular document and process we're talking about. And finally, John Odell is Chief Sustainability and Resilience Officer for the City of Worcester, tasked with implementing the ambitious and urgent goals and actions of the Green Worcester Action Plan. As Director of Worcester's Energy and Asset Management Division, he worked in partnership with the Green Worcester Working Group, a collective of city, staff, environmental groups, residents, and a consultant to develop the plan we're looking at today, which aims for Worcester to be sustainable and resilient by the year 2050. And the plan was adopted by the Worcester City Council last year. So that's a springboard to our conversation. And I'm relatively new to thinking about these climate plans. I know there are people here in the room who've thought more about that. But let me just ask, I think I may begin with John Fernández and ask you, how do you tell a successful climate plan from an unsuccessful one? What are the, does it matter? Is it just about meeting objectives, or like what's a good plan?
Well, so nice to be with all of you. So short answers, right?
Sure.
Okay. So
I
think I'll just add one little piece, and there's probably 30 things you could say. One piece is what's the level of engagement of the stakeholders that you've targeted, that you have in mind? I mean, Worcester, I would say, what's the level of engagement across business, communities, institutions, government? You could scale that whichever way you want. You could scale it to the planetary scale. What's the level of engagement of the countries on delivering their nationally determined commitments to reduce carbon emissions? You know, I'd say that's one measure of success of a climate plan, and that measure of success comes pretty quickly after the climate plan is developed, whether you're talking about university's climate plan or the climate plan for the planet. So I think engagement is one measure of success. Yeah.
And are those always stakeholders, or even aware they're stakeholders?
Well, so there are some that don't know. So for example, I just got back from Colombia just last week, and the Pacific region is called the Departamento de Chocó, and they're part of Colombia's climate action plan, but they don't know that. The people who live there and its Afro-descendant communities are not really connected to the national plan, but they don't know it, and in some ways it doesn't really matter that they would know, because actually what they're doing now as Afro-descendant communities, they are actually very powerful protectors of the biodiversity in the tropical forests where they live. So they're actually delivering, without even knowing, real priority for Colombia's action plan. Okay. So you don't have to necessarily know. But the question is, are they engaged? Well, by default, they're engaged, right?
It'll certainly impact them. I'd love to come back to that question as we think about Worcester, about what people know, but maybe to ask either of you, how did you know, what did success look like for you as you were going into this? What was your hope? Or how would you know you got there?
Well, I'm kind of curious what Karin says so that I can learn for this as we implement it going forward. But I think engagement is a critical piece. I think the other piece that I would add to that is the resources, the money that comes in behind the engagement. Engaged people, candidly, are just not enough. If you don't have the resources to implement the changes you want to do, then you're not going to get too far. So what we've tried to do for the city is where the engagement piece and the resource piece, of course, are tied hand in hand. So you need the engagement to get people to buy in, literally, into making the changes you want to make. And that can spur the resources. It can actually influence people in two ways. There's the people that are already somewhat interested, and you can get them on board to either in terms of action or in terms of finances that they can provide. And equally as important, but often overlooked, is it gets some of the people that are often in the way out of the way, because they recognize that there's too much potential resistance if they become obstacles going forward. So getting that engagement in a broad as well as a deep way is critical to the success of this plan, and as John mentioned, whether it's for the city or university or ultimately for the planet itself. So there's multiple pieces in how you do that, and that I'm sure will come up as we go forward. But in a nutshell, I would say that's the other half of what John was talking about.
Can I add one little piece? The resource is super important. So on a global scale, the commitments that have been made towards climate actions are 1/10 of what's needed. we're only 10% of the way there. And this is now long-standing. This is not just this year. This has been now for, almost 10 years. So engagement is there. Countries are engaged. They go to the COPs, right? They go to Glasgow and they'll go to Egypt, but they're not ponying up, right? They're not funding what they say needs to get done.
So if global is 10%, where would Massachusetts fall? What percent of the way are we?
Massachusetts towards climate plan? Actually pretty well, because on the one hand, we have RGGI, which is the Regional Greenhouse Gas Inventory.
Initiative.
Initiative, right. So, carbon price, basically, regional carbon price. But also, individual cities, Worcester, Boston, have very progressive plans towards climate change. So, and it's also, frankly, we're in a relatively wealthy part of the world. So resources are, of course, they're never enough, really, but much better situation than, most of the rest of the world.
And based on what we consume, it makes it more urgent, as a wealthy part of the world.
Yeah, well,
we
we can get into that. Okay. That's a good point.
What would success, how did you think about it?
So I'm going to pick up on what the John said in terms of engagement, but I'm going to add an extra piece to that, which is the word equity, which is that engagement means different things. So it depends, and certainly in the public health world, people are really pivoting to focus on equity first, and that engagement of community. So I do a lot of work in the active transportation space, and there's a whole long history of public engagement being a particular way of doing it. Come to our meetings, answer our questions. I think public health is slowly getting to the point where they're saying, going to where people are and actually engaging them in the ways that where they are, in the ways that they want to speak about things, and asking about their lived experience. So, so there's the equity side. The other thing I'd say about success is when it's easy to, and I think to lump, or maybe less so now, but environmental, people working on environmental issues into a category, and for some people to dismiss that. Again, it's getting the climate crisis is so urgent, maybe that is not as true now. But so I think some of the success will come when climate action goals are actually represented in other kinds of plans, community health improvement plans, transportation plans that are separate from climate action, but where it gets absorbed and implemented in other ways.
So I think the equity question cuts to the heart of the matter for me. Can you give me a concrete example here where the equity question came into play?
So, what do you mean with the Green Worcester plan?
Green, yeah, and the process and the who.
I'm going to ask John actually, and I'm not just kicking it because I don't think that I have a good answer for that. I guess the way that I was involved as a stakeholder, I still didn't see a cross section of people represented in the input to the plan, cross-section demographically. And that is not a slight. It goes back to the question of resources, how much resource, how are you going to deploy your resources to create a plan and to then put into implementation?
So I'll go to John on that, but at least when I'm hearing equity, I'm thinking that when we talk about environmental justice, that it would maybe poorer people in poorer neighborhoods who are more impacted by pollution factors and maybe by climate factors as well, I suppose, who might bear more of the brunt of it. Is the equity question that they're not so much contributors to the conversation as?
Right, because many of the folks who underrepresented groups are not going to come to, if you have public meetings where you're asking for public input or you have a survey, even if you have multiple languages, that may not be a mechanism, a way to get that public input. There could be other methods that could be used to actually get more meaningful input from groups that you're interested in.
Yeah, it's a follow up on two parts, and that's a real issue. I will point out that we have three lenses we were thinking about when we put together the plan at first, and that we continue to do in terms of, now that we have it, in terms of implementation. Equity was one of the three. Economic prosperity, we got to make sure that we can afford what we're doing, of course, and make sure that it actually can be sustainable. And then, last but not least, we're looking through a health lens. All those tying together, as you might suspect. So equity, it was one of the primary pieces that we were cared about. But Karen's absolutely right, and it continues to be an issue right now. Is we have I'll give you an example. We have an advisory committee that we're looking to help with what we're doing here. So we reach out to the community. We're going to have 7 folks that their gig, if you will, is to not just help us implement the plan, but act as a communication tool with their networks. They represent each of the districts and a few other key folks, groups that we want to make sure are included. And we have struggled very hard to get people who would be interested in this, despite some very direct and deliberate outreach to folks that we often, as a city, don't reach out to get people on board to serve on that commission. We have some 6 people right to date out of 7, and of the 6, all of them are great. I don't want to be, but they look a lot like this room for the most part. So that's an issue. So we're really pushing hard for the 7th one. We're hoping we can get someone who can have both a different perspective than what we traditionally get. So that's a real big issue. And I think Karen's absolutely right. And again, one last bit is that the difference, it's really important to the difference between equal opportunity and equity. Those two things are not the same. So what we got to be very careful of is that when we told you about the meeting, how come that's equal opportunity, right? We blasted it on all our normal social media feeds. We put it in the newspaper. That is what we've always done, and we're very good at it. I don't want to pat myself on the back, being a member of this fair city for the last decade or so, but we are good at that. What we candidly stink at, and what a lot of groups stink at, is that we don't target that more directly to the people who are impacted the most. So I'll leave it at that.
But isn't that, do you mind?
Please.
Isn't that a question of equity? In other words, just sort of the simple scenario of asking somebody to spend time on a board when they are totally stressed with job, childcare, whatever else, is a question of equity. It's actually kind of unfair to ask them to now dedicate their time to a board. And I'm just wondering whether there's, to some extent, it's pretty clear what low-income neighborhoods and people in communities need. They need more resources. So there's not a lot of talk that's needed.
Yeah, I would first, of course, agree on the front end there. It is often an extra burden that no one likes to do, no matter who you are. It's just another thing in our already very busy lives. But having said that, we're hopeful. I mean, it's not like there's nobody who could step up to this who has some interest in this. That's not the case. And I give you an example. Is we did a survey before we did the Green Worcester plan that sort of, we wanted to understand what the community really cared about, and we knew that the only way that we could get some decent feedback is if we did a scientific survey, with telephone survey. We would reach out to folks across all demographics, make sure it was as balanced as possible. And the interesting thing about how many people cared about the need to become a more sustainable city was of the people. It was really encouraging. First, I think it was 89 or 90% thought it was a high priority, so that was really good. And the people who thought it was, high or somewhat high totaled 90%. Of the folks who thought it was very high, I think it was, of that 90, I think it was 64%. But it was 59% of the white folks thought that, and it was whatever, the 72% of people of color. So the interest is clearly there. I mean, it's actually more there than it is with the constituency we have here, is again to make the point. And so yes, I would agree with you, but I would also say that part of that is on us to reach out to folks where they are. You don't have to be on the committee to participate in this. You can participate in other ways too. And that's on us to figure out that and meet them where they are.
So it helps me in one way, because I was trying to think about this old-fashioned environmental cleanup things that happen in Worcester versus climate initiatives, which can seem sort of like fixing the wiring. I was thinking a lot of things that you include. If I'm there and I might want to park near me or something very concrete, I could see kind of rallying for that. But it seems, I was wondering if there's some degree to which the things that need to be fixed are more technocratic. They're plumbing issues, or it's hard to get really excited about whether Worcester City Hall will have new electrical systems or heating systems, or the things that go into, that I saw in the climate action plan. So I wondered if there was a way that the deliverables for me seemed fewer. And I was thinking too, now, I don't want it to be said, Tom Landy is in favor of bike lanes, but do things like bike lanes come to be seen as sort of class issues that maybe aren't immediate? So what are the particular elements of a climate action plan, and how do they seem like things that my city manager should just fix for me, or I should get involved and I really have a stake in?
Actually, I want to answer two things, because you just brought up an issue that I wanted to make. The research is increasing on, if you just address the what and not the how and the who, that you can end up widening disparities. I mean, it's not just what intuitively makes sense, but research. And again, I'm relying on sort of active transportation stuff in this context. But the other point I wanted to make—
So the what and the how, can you say just what?
So I'll use the public health examples. And for 2022, for over 20 years, the public health field has really focused on the connections between more walkable communities and people's physical activity and their chronic disease prevention and overall health. And so there's just endless correlations between features in the built environment and people's behaviors and their disease outcomes. But there has been relatively little work, and this is part of what my team does, is separate from WalkBike Worcester, but what I do with the Prevention Research Center at the medical school, which is really about looking at how helping people at the community level as well as researchers understand how decisions are made and affecting that. Public health is very fond of saying we need policy systems and environmental changes. Okay, policy change, fairly easy, intuitive to understand what that would mean. Environmental changes can result from those policy changes, but what the heck is a system? What does that mean? Well, system is, altogether, the policies, the practices, and also the culture of a community. Honestly, that's going to be one of the hardest things for improving active transportation in Worcester is the culture. But so one of the things that just aiming for policy and practice change without community education is only going to go so far. And I think helping people understand why actions at City Hall level, are connected with their everyday lives can help increase the public support that ultimately will generate more resources, and then it can build on itself.
Have you seen examples that you hold up where this process has worked particularly well in terms of equity and involvement in the United States? I know you mentioned.
Yeah, in the United States. So in Boston and New York City, both, there have been very good processes to engage the community at many different levels on issues of climate change, on green buildings, on community engagement, on recycling, pollution, local pollution, and then transportation issues as well. Chicago's also, done very well by engaging the community. I think the engagement of communities of color, low-income communities, I think that it's difficult because I go back to this issue that, there are multiple other issues: education, health, income. If I were in the situation where I was worried about my rent, every month, didn't quite make it to pay for food, to buy enough food for my kids, sustainability I'd be totally not interested in sustainability. And in fact, I'd be put off by some kind of call for engagement. Of course, there are outliers, people who And I've met many of these people. I've met them here in the United States and also in even worse conditions in Latin America and India and in Indonesia. But I do think that there is the equity issues. Just it's not quite getting to what really needs to happen, which is kind of a wholesale revision of the way that people live in this capitalist society. Now that's a big opener for a huge conversation, but I do think that that's sustainability and climate change actions aren't going to go very far until people have good health care, health care that's free, that's available and accessible, good education, which we're kind of going in the opposite direction in both in this country. So anyway, I don't want to rant.
So I don't disagree with that. I'm thinking sort of what are the elements of this? And we've come up with healthcare, and when I was first thinking of a sustainability initiative, I wasn't thinking in terms of public health and healthcare. So how does it work that you bundle all these issues together? How do you know when there are too many issues bundled in? How do you build political consensus?
Yeah, I'm not going to answer that question, but I want to make one point, which is that public health and healthcare are not the same. And healthcare is only responsible for 10% roughly of health outcomes. And public health uses the wonky term social determinants of health. Finally getting away from focusing on healthcare to think about education and economic issues. And I guess I was thinking of many years ago, 15 years ago or so, when our city went through a series of severe budget cuts, and I was doing some education advocacy. And I remember standing up at City Hall and saying, one of the people that was with me, a friend, said, "I'm a single issue voter, I'm only here about education." And I was like, well, I'm not a single issue voter. I think that's what we want people to be interested in, to begin to understand how sustainability could actually serve some of their other personal needs in a more sustainable community.
Yeah, that's actually a great segue, I think, because one of the things that we've recognized, so very quick back piece on the Green Worcester plan is it's important to recognize that it's what the plan is and what it isn't. And the plan is not a prescriptive, here's what the city is going to do kind of thing. It's sort of the analogy I like to think of. It's the difference between a menu at the restaurant and the recipe for one of the dishes. So the Green Worcester plan is sort of like an umbrella plan of which other action plans are hung from it. And just, it's funny, we talk about this just now and how important it is, and but about 2 weeks ago, quick story on this is that we have been talking about this. My boss, the city manager, has been giving me grief, I'll say it nicely, for the last half decade about how all the good things we're doing in Worcester and no one knows about them. How come, John? And meaning me, not John. Even though I did forward a lot of emails your way, I hope that wasn't a problem. No. But he was concerned that and I would respond saying, look, we've done this thing that we've always done, and I've done a lot of it, and as if that was the solution. Good on me. And it just exemplifies the fact that the same old way of doing things is not actually moving the needle. And so 2 weeks ago, one of the people on our new advisory committee said, you've done I just learned so much at our first meeting because you just gave a presentation of what we've done and where we're trying to go, and wow, this is great. How come no one knows about this? And everyone, it's funny, everyone immediately turned to me to look at me, and I will look to the person behind, oh, look at all you guys. Hi. But there was no one there because we didn't really have I didn't have a good answer for that. So I asked this woman, if you're a communications expert, what should we do? And her suggestion was, you're telling it all wrong. No one likes, whether you're a business or a nonprofit or a city, to say, hey, look what I've done. Look what I've done. Gather around, everybody. Here's the great story I want to tell you about the thing I did. Yeah, that is a recipe for non-success. So what they suggested is intuitively, once you think about it, what else would you do is you write a story that connects people about people. You write a story about people and how this solves a problem for them, which I think ties in with what Karin was saying too, is that, And what John's saying as well is that it's gotta somehow, the connection to different people, whatever their backgrounds are, is the key of meeting where they are. Well, the way you do that is through not just talking at them, but talking with them. And that's where we're trying to come up with a way, all right, what's the best way to do that? And that's gonna be one of those things that hangs off the Green Worcester plan, is essentially a strategic communication plan. And, that's something that we're gonna probably want to engage with some of the universities to help with us, because that is, we don't have a large budget, but this is something where we can get folks out in the community who can help us, what kind of stories resonate, and then we can take those, what stories resonate, and build from there on the stuff we do and make those connections. So, that was long-winded, sorry.
I'd love to say more though about what is in it. I was going through this, there's stormwater management, so it may be hard to get, stormwater is an exciting story for people sometimes, but,
Not if your basement floods.
renewable energy, there's renewable energy, a lot of sort of behind the scenes, I think, is sort of plumbing or wiring kinds of things that are going that,
Yeah.
so they're harder to see. But tell us what's in it, 'cause it seems like there's an awful lot that, I've looked at some of it, but I'm not presuming our audience has, so.
Sure. Well, the very high level, and I don't want to monopolize this, but we broke it down into 10 pieces, and I won't remember all 10, and now 11, because we have a communications plan too, that's in there. So that's not called out, but it's basically, we're looking at transportation, we're looking at waste management, or zero waste if we can. We're looking at emissions reduction in buildings. We're looking at trying to make sure that we have a mobility plan that goes with that transportation effort, because mobility is not the same thing as what typically is thought about transportation. We're looking at how we create and produce food and distribute that, which is obviously a key piece of sustainability.
So local food.
Local food, right. Quick fun fact, we have 61 community gardens in Worcester, which is about 60 more than I thought we had when I first started this job. So that's great, and we want to build on those successes. We want to manage our water as efficiently as possible, our blue spaces. Our green spaces, we want to make sure we focus on, so that's another whole chapter is on that, and that connects with the, both urban planning, transportation, our built infrastructure. So each one of those has a chapter, and then 9 of them really, and then the 10th is sort of like the wrapping it all together chapter as to how this all works. So that's how we framed it. Everyone likes, I was a big fan of Dave Letterman back in the day, and a top 10 list struck me as a good way to go. So.
And measurable ways to think if you've succeeded or failed at that in 2030 at the end?
Exactly. So there are we tried not to have too many prescriptive goals, as I mentioned earlier, but we did have some key pieces so that by 2030, we have some goals that on the municipal side to be 100% net zero on the municipal side. By 2035, we're going to have all the electricity in the city for everybody, effectively net zero from green. And then by 2045, it's to make all the energy, both for heating, hot water, and any other use transportation, all of that would be net zero, which is daunting when I say it out loud. But I'll be retired, so I'll be all right.
So when he's retired, John, what sort of things that Karin or John, what else should be in there? There's an awful lot in there already. But
Well, so there's net zero and then there's zero, right? And so the net zero I think it would be important to note that that's an interim condition, right? We actually have to get to zero. So the net zero, and I'm sure you'll get there in a number of different ways, purchase power agreements and lots of other things, but that's the thing that's going to have to continue to happen, is to actually get down to zero, because at the end of the day, you've used this phrase wiring and plumbing. At the end of the day, however equitable we are, however engaged the community is, however healthcare and everything else benefits, if carbon emissions are not reduced to zero in 2050, net zero, we have a catastrophe on our hands. And that's kind of the reality of so yeah. So I'll
So it
just-
sinks in for me that Worcester's this growing city. I see a growing campus here. You know, we may be building better buildings, but we're building a lot more of them too, so
Yeah.
the
I'll just say
getting
one,
to zero.
I'll say one quick thing about that. So there's the net zero, and then there's the accounting for carbon emissions that's done, and it's gonna be done, you know, in a much more detailed and much more rigorous way than ever before. That's great. Generally speaking, we're not accounting for our production carbon emissions, our consumption carbon emissions. Producing buildings, so, you know, someday we'll have a net zero carbon building, including embodied carbon. So do you guys know what that means, embodied carbon?
Go ahead.
So most buildings, 80 to 90% of carbon emissions during the life cycle of the building is during operation. When the lights are on, you know, so somewhere somewhere carbon is being emitted because we have the lights on. But then there's all these materials, right? The wood and the concrete and the glass and everything else. That stuff was made somewhere, and there was carbon emissions emitted when that was made. So that's the embodied carbon. That is not emitted here. It's just embodied in the material. So generally speaking, a good kind of proportion is that most buildings, 80-20, 90-10 operational versus embodied. That'll change as buildings become much more energy efficient. So when you look at the consumption side, so that's the building, and maybe that building will get to net zero or zero. But it's all the other stuff. It's our laptops, it's our clothing, it's our the water, the devices we have, all that stuff. We're not accounting for the carbon emissions from consumption. And the wealthy, and this is across the world, the wealthier you are, the more carbon emissions you're emitting by way of your consumption. Really quick anecdote. So Sweden has made this claim to be heading towards net zero carbon, and they've made this claim that they've decoupled their economy. Does anybody? I want to act like a professor and call somebody.
Go ahead.
Anybody know what decoupling means of an economy means? No. So there's the financial creating wealth and consuming materials, and to create more wealth, you generally need to consume more materials, right? Well, if you decouple those two and you create wealth, but you're not consuming more materials, like an example of that, a service economy, a digital economy, you know, a less material-intensive economy starts to decouple those two things. So you can create a lot of wealth and not consume as much materials. So Sweden makes the point that they're decoupled, and if you're just looking within the border of the country and say, oh, have you decoupled, you know, you're creating wealth and your industries are going to net zero. But when you look at their consumption,
Things made elsewhere.
with including all those imports of stuff that comes into the country, then you blow it out of the water. They're nowhere near getting to net zero. And so that's a transfer of the burden of carbon emissions to generally to the developing world. And so that will happen, is happening in this country as well. Some regions are not really going in that direction, and some regions are. We are, but some regions are not being as aggressive as this region is.
So let me open it up, because people may have questions or comments. I mean, I have continued questions. We could do more about the process. So what does it take to get to this? It's a political process, a social process. How you mobilize people to do that is one of the questions I think we can keep coming to. But what questions or comments do others among you have? Somebody must have brought a question or two. Otherwise, Professor Fernández is going to ask you
Question about
questions.
food in the city. So I grew up in upstate New York. It's a little bit more rural. And the idea of a farmer's market there is a truly wonderful place. Very vibrant, very full, very active. Looked for a while in Cambridge.
Yep.
Again, farmers markets are big and huge. Cambridge is a very rich community, so it makes a lot of sense. Farmers market, and I don't mean to disparage, but in Worcester is fairly disappointing. It's relatively small. There's not a lot of choice and stuff. So in terms of local food, because they're in the area, but they're choosing not to come to Worcester, how do you make Worcester more attractive for local food like
So I can give you, I'm not sure if this will completely answer your question, but I mean, you said at the front of your remarks that, you know, the farmers come from they go to the wealthier areas because people put out more money that way. But there's a lot of work that's been going on for a number of years with Regional Environmental Council, with the Coalition for Healthy Greater Worcester, building systems that allow people from a broader range of the community to be able to tap that using, you know, EDT and things like that. So there's creative work. Maybe it's too quiet, to John's earlier point. So I don't disagree with the fact that we'd all love that vibrancy, but there's different ways to knit it together. And that I think that conversely, if you go to a farmer's market here, you may see a better representation of people than you might in some of the wealthier districts.
Worcester actually ranks third in the nation for direct buying from farmers. We just don't see it. It's restaurants.
Just looking at the farmers markets themselves, it depends on the variety, the size, the choice. How do you build it? It doesn't seem to have been built a whole lot in the last 20 years.
Well, some of it's, I mean, there was a guy who ran the farmers markets for years and years who was sort of a cantanker sort of guy. So I don't think, you know, people have been rebuilding since he moved on. So.
Please.
A question on the kind of more planning side. It seems like, you know, you hinted at some large structural changes that will need to take place. I was wondering, and you know, there's definitely like personal decisions on things that will need to change in individuals' lives. You know, you talked about consumption, but on the planning side, what kind of needs to change in our daily use of, especially thinking about Worcester in terms of getting to net zero or getting to like what physical infrastructure or how we relate to each other, societal changes, would you highlight as like, especially in the near term?
Yeah, I'll take a shot at that. It's a big question. It's a good question. It's so the planning. What we're focused on right now, besides the communication plan, which I talked about, is we've already recognized you know, the need to lower our carbon emissions. So we're basically focusing on three main pieces in the near term. This will mirror the stories that we're looking at. One is the reduction of the emissions, one is the heat island effect, and one is our existing lakes and ponds program, which is pretty successful already, and we want to just build on that. So the emissions one in particular, we're just now doing a true up. The last time we did a good deep dive in what the emissions were for Worcester was 2009. So, whoops, a little late. So we're looking to get that trued up through 2019 to start. We're almost there on that. And then to 2021, once all that data becomes available. Some of that data lags a fair bit. And we didn't do 2020 because of COVID, and we knew it would kind of skew things a bit. So the planning piece on that is sort of, you gotta, and the way I look at it is it's gotta be, you work from, first you gotta know where you are. You know, you can't manage what you don't measure, Peter Drucker's famous saying, and I totally buy into that. So we gotta first know where we are, and then based on that, we can sort of target where the places are. We know in general where the two places are, and primarily buildings and transportation. That's going to be the lion's share right there. Probably, you know, 85% of the total is going to be in those two buckets. And then the next bit is, all right, now we got to get a transportation mobility plan. And I would mention two things. The Green Worcester plan, in terms of successes, that came up earlier, and this just reminded me of it, is one of the things that came out of it is you need a sustainability department, and you need it at the cabinet level in our city. You know, it can't be a subset of something else where it can get buried. That has happened. We talked about transportation and how there's a lot of bifurcation right now in the city in terms of who's responsible for what, and how there's sometimes the silos create impasses for people to communicate, and we just end up doing the exact same thing we've done for years. And so now there's a transportation department in the works for next year. and a mobility plan that will come immediately on the heels of that, that will inform what the transportation department should look like as we build that
Can you
out.
specify the distinction you made between mobility and transportation? You alluded to it, but we didn't.
Yeah, no, it's good, and it's really, it's mostly partly semantic, but it's just, when people think of transportation, they think of the main things like mostly car-centric, the roads, and the other stuff. And mobility is kind of reversing that, is to think more about how people move, where they need to move to. So it's not just how they move, but where they're going to, what kind of policy changes should be made so that we can get the things that people need most in a place where they could walk or bike to and don't need to hop in a car or have access to public transportation, those kinds of things. So that's sort of the difference between how I'm defining the two. And so we're gonna have a mobility plan in place, hopefully by the end of this calendar year. And as the transportation department fills out, it will be informed by this plan, and the goal is that by FY '24, so not this coming fiscal year, but the one after that, they'll have the resources in place and the plan in place to actually implement something far better than what we're currently doing, and to match up with the Green Worcester plan's expectations and goals.
But I'm gonna jump in here and really put on my advocate hat, which is that,
Go.
and I've known John for a long time, so I won't be surprised about something. But, so I'm personally very excited that, that there's proposed to be a Department of Transportation, no matter what the exact name comes out to be. I would also say that, I think accessibility is more is a more, whatever, comprehensive term than mobility, or appropriate term than mobility. But the other thing that, the plans are important, and I think Worcester's plans have gotten better. I mentioned earlier about needing changes with policy and practice. There's a lot of stuff buried in the city in practice that is not going to get surfaced in a plan. And I just want to give a nod, if Dennis is still here, to Dennis Kennedy, one of your professors here,
Dennis
who
was in
is
someone.
associated
There he is,
with,
there's
there he is, with WalkBike Worcester, which is that, advocacy groups are important for pushing, particularly in the city. The city is not known for transparency. And things need to, yes, plans, but also there needs to be a lot of change in practice and a lot more transparency in how. So changes, student asked about what needs to be changed in planning, but I would argue that part of the changes in administration and in planning have to do with transparency. The best communities in this country, and I think you'd agree, internationally, are the places that are more transparent with their decision-making and how they bring people in.
Can I shift the discussion a little bit? Because I never get a chance to be in front of Holy Cross students. This is the first time I've been in front of Holy Cross students. So is this stuff important to you guys or not? Why? Why is it important? I mean, like, actually important, or you're just kind of saying that because it wouldn't be very nice to say no in this venue? Yeah, but like, how is it actually important? And please go ahead. You nodded your head very vociferously. So.
She did.
Well, it's funny because this is actually just a personal passion of mine. I think climate resilience in particular is something that I'm really passionate about. I'm a political science and environmental studies major, so I think that looking at institutions, and especially I'm here in the city of Worcester, so looking at how the city of Worcester has handled climate change and how it plans to in the future, and just again looking at the community and seeing kind of the moving parts has been something that's really rewarding, and as I'm a senior and kind of like getting to know it is something that's really important.
So it's central to what you kind of want to do.
Yes.
and all that. I also just don't want to have this session end before and forget to say that the Worcester plans is a fabulous plan. It's got it's got pretty much everything you would want, and of course then that begs the question of how to get it all done, implementation. But it is a really great model for, and actually the point that is most important to me is that part of the value of plans like this is for other cities to look at these kinds of plans and to really use it, and so it's very helpful. Is this important to anyone else for another reason? Yeah.
I think we've known for a long time that the climate's changing. working, and like for a long time we've just been deflecting that kind of responsibility. And I feel like our generation has kind of come to the point where like we can't deflect it anymore. We're seeing the effects of it. We see it happening around us in Worcester, around the world. So I feel like it's come to the point where our generation really does need to care, and so we do because we have to.
Yeah, okay. Other, yeah,
I feel like there's a big concern around our generation wanting to, use our voice, our political representation, our actions to be able to alleviate the crisis as much as we can, but there's also a lack of awareness of what to advocate for. So
Yeah.
There's a lot of conversation around renewables, but sitting in this talk, you guys are hitting on a bunch of different things I never really considered as part of this. So, I don't know, kind of a question or something I'm wondering is like, how we as like citizens can like leverage our political power to change those institutions and call for more synergistic type of solutions, like something in the Worcester plan, which I wasn't even aware of the thing before I sat down here.
yeah. I mean, so one way is to become ambassadors of the Worcester plan, right? To get it out there, to spread the word, to what, however you would do that. At COP26 in Glasgow, there was a very different feeling than any other COP that I'd been to, that the protests and generally young people were just as relevant as what was happening in the formal governmental negotiations, and maybe even more relevant because nothing was happening in those government negotiations really in the end. And actually, your point is, you're part of a global community of young people who are saying enough already, blah blah blah, right? And that's different. The previous COPs I've been to, there were protests, but they weren't nearly as organized. They're large and as well covered as the ones this past. So, there is momentum there. Having said that, and I'll be quick. Having said that, you guys are up against some really major counter interests. So, not to talk about politics, but Russia, and not to talk about Ukraine, but Russia really wants climate change. It's really good for Russia, for Russian agriculture. It's a brand new ocean. The Arctic Ocean without ice is a bonanza, right, for shipping. So Russia really wants climate change. Not only that, there are many companies that are in this game of climate profiteering. I talked to Anglo American yesterday, this group of rising executives in this huge mining company. And when you really get down to it, they want to know what to do about climate change, but they really want to know how to make sure what they do about climate change is also going to make them a ton of money, right? And so there's companies are not moral entities, right? They just aren't. And despite Mark Benioff and Larry Fink and Yvonne Chouinard saying, well, companies should have, there should be stakeholder capitalism. Do you guys know what that is? That should happen? How's that?
I said it just sounds, I don't know what it is. But
Yeah, stakeholder capitalism means that you're responsible to a much broader group of stakeholders than just your shareholders. You're more responsible to your employees, to the community you work in, to your families, all of that. You take a much broader sense of what your.
It's a better perspective than others that preached about capitalism.
But the ones who are advocating this kind of position, total outliers. 99% of CEOs are like, the quarter's coming up, we have to have a positive, earnings report. So I don't want to. It's a reality check to give you greater momentum. You're going to have to fight dirty and hard to win, because boy, the other side is certainly going to. So.
Yeah, and I would add, don't underestimate your power though, because that often you can get, it can look so daunting that you're frozen into inaction, and that happens all the time in a wide variety of things. And this is sort of the global one that's freezing a lot of people. And only just now people are waking up to it. That, oh my gosh, that's me. This is my future. And I would add that if it's painful, and I will be the first to say, to attend a city council meeting or some of the subcommittee meetings, and I would never advocate that anyone do that on a regular basis. But on occasion, I would advocate that you would take a look at what the agendas are, and that once in a while, when it touches on this, is that you show up. Because even if it's online, they have to listen to everybody. It's amazing how much that counts. It's even better when you reach out to your counselor directly and say, hey, I live in district blah, 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 and I've noticed, I really would like to, I thought the Green Worcester plan was really good, and I'm a big advocate of whatever your topic of interest is, and explain a little bit why, and let's pursue more of that. I get phone calls from counselors about that. It does go right through. What can we do about that? And then when I have that ammunition to make the argument to my boss and get the support of the council, or at least get some of the counselors who don't care as much about this to stop saying no, to get those resources that we talked about that can start moving the needle. It's a self-perpetuating thing, but unless they hear from everybody, they just do what they always do. And inertia is a real thing. And so it's going to take a real effort on your part. I think the reality check is exactly right. It's going to take a lot of work to do it. No one's going to be able to do it. I'm not going to be able to do it. My little team of 6 of us is not going to do it for the fair city. That's not enough. We're going to have a lot more engagement in general, and that candidly is all you guys.
And I'll put in a pitch for, I have a daughter who's a junior in college and one who's about to graduate from high school. A lot of people, I guess the pandemic changed a lot of things about where people were moving to, but obviously the big cities have some real attractions for people fresh out of college. But a place like Worcester has its warts for sure, but it's also the kind of place where you can actually know people, elected officials, people in City Hall. It's easier than you think it is, and it can be very rewarding. And Worcester has, below the level of elected and appointed officials, a whole network of people who work together on related issues, like I was saying earlier. And I think I've lived in bigger, more sophisticated places.
I want to ask you a question before I go to Chris. Or we have one?
Well, you had a question.
Oh, okay, good.
Yeah, so can you give an example of something Worcester could do to foster engagement going forward, particularly in regards to, implementing sustainability plans? I mean, I guess this, fishbowl discussion doesn't count, but I feel like, sitting talking, doing something, but it's not exactly, fundamentally changing the
No, and I would caution, you're right, of course.
Could you repeat the question for us?
Yeah, it's, what kind of community engagement is needed to move the needle, if I summed it up right?
Yeah.
And this, is a piece of that, but it's by itself not going to do it. And so what can we do? And I would say 2 things. I would say don't underestimate these kinds of things, because it's amazing what the little things, and you hear something and all of a sudden that person talks to a counselor or someone else and say, hey, I went to this thing, it was kind of cool, and blah, 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 blah. And that feedback can be very real and powerful, even when you don't recognize it up front or at first. But the second thing is it's this times 1,000. It's this kind of stuff, your own network of things is to every now and again you throw something in there related to it. You can, whatever your comfort level is, not everyone wants to be a evangelist for this stuff. I get that. I'm not really keen on doing it often myself, and that's my job. But it is really important to be able to do what you can. And so a lot of times people don't think that it's going to matter, but it does. It does more than you think. So I would certainly, if I'm gonna, I'll shut up, but I would end with that, is it really does count.
If I could add to that, so one thing that can be done is that communities can be supported in submitting grant proposals to the federal government. There are a whole range of them, and communities usually need support to get into that whole process. But they, you know, if they receive grants from the federal government, they're in control of those monies. They can do something locally in the way that they want to do locally, which aligns with the plans, right? So it's best if one of the things that the Worcester plan does is it gives a community the basis for then applying for monies in federal government, state government even. And that's a concrete thing that communities can be supported in doing. And that's like a next step. Obviously, that involves organizing the community, making sure that people have the time to do it, and that they're interested in particular things, and that they're applying for the right kinds of funds. So.
And that they're going to be applying for a grant, for example, that's for a piece of something. I think it's a little hard to think about the 10 sectors all at once, and so I guess it's picking the piece that you might want to be that's involved with. And I will put in a plug, and anybody can contact Professor Kennedy about getting on our list, walkbikegoo@gmail. So, because we are focused on the active transportation, on the transportation piece, but it's connecting with groups that are doing work that is relevant to climate, but might not be called that.
I'm thinking of all the bundle of things that we put together in the Holy Cross education, and I'm thinking, you're from MIT, right?
Yeah.
So for some people, you want to solve these problems, I don't know, maybe I should go to MIT and specialize, but obviously we have strengths in the sciences or in the social sciences, the way we put. So like if you were talking to a kid about Holy Cross education who's here who wants to do some of this, sure, you can take Professor Finstein's class, or you can take a chemistry class, or an economics class, or a biology class. Like, what's the bundle of things that maybe kids put together that are actually needed, the skill set, the speaking skills, the public, how do you?
Well, one of the reasons I asked, is this important to you, and you answered with political science, I think, is that when I think of MIT students, you know, there are a bunch of students who are now looking at climate change as like this golden egg, right, for startup ideas, venture money. I mean, there's a ton of venture money interested in climate change solutions. I actually just started a company with a postdoc and an undergrad to use drones to do building energy diagnostics using machine learning to return information about a building's energy use in like 1/50th the time that it would take an energy auditor to do that. And we are being like, we're at a pre-seed level. There's a ton of money chasing these climate solutions. So MIT undergrads are, a number of them are in that, they're thinking in those terms. And that's great, right? Make a ton of money, solve a problem. But, and the technology, and one thing that I mean, maybe obvious for an MIT professor to say, but there's this phrase that, you know, don't use technology to solve problems that the technology wrought on us, right? I totally don't believe in that phrase. I mean, you've got hundreds of examples where technology solved a problem that a previous technology created. So that doesn't hold water. So there is a real place for technology development and innovation and all that. However, the social sciences, the political ecology of all of these issues, the economics is absolutely central to all of this. If there isn't an economics component, understanding of things, you mentioned it, and in implementation, then none of this stuff is going to get off the ground. So but then there's also the liberal arts, the communication, the writing, the messaging that's super important. In this country, we have a problem with climate change because the message has been perverted, right? Has been distorted. Of what climate change actually is, and that's led to an actual wholesale denial of science. And, I would never have predicted that we'd be here, but for anyone interested in that, like, you know, the broader themes of the direction society is going, and liberal arts education is really key to that. So everybody has a role. There's no question that it's like energy, like the energy transition. It's all of the above. It's every energy, you know, type that's going to be needed and in different proportions. It's the same in disciplines. It's all of the above. All the disciplines are going to be needed to solve this problem. So you don't think that you don't have a role. If you don't make a role for yourself, that's a conscious choice. You decided not to have a role in solving climate change. Look at it that way.
Great. Anything you think, like good Holy Cross students can, well-educated, well-directed Holy Cross students can contribute to your work that they need to know and learn and bundle up.
Well, having been a Holy Cross student, I can advocate for you all that there's potential there, and I say that truly. If you knew how well I did at the school, so you know that there's potential. I think Holy Cross has. I think you hit the point extremely well when John was saying that it's an all or above piece. A lot of it is the stories we tell and how we can to do that. Whether the communication is strictly in our learning how to write better and communicate. I mean, I was a philosophy major, so go figure. So if a philosophy major can have some success in this field, then I would argue that anybody in this room certainly could. But the stories we tell, just to finish the thought, the stories we tell can be done from a wide variety of vantages, and that's, I think, where at Holy Cross education, particularly any liberal arts education, can be really advantageous, because I think part of that education is the understanding of the stories and how they connect, and that's the connection piece is the key piece to making sure that people don't, as I said at the beginning, that you can get people to get on board, or equally as important, to get the people, the naysayers, to at least get out of the way. I'll stop there.
Well, I was going to say, as a former English major, I mean, you don't know what your next choice is going to be, and how each choice, shapes the next opportunity or the next layer of education you get or experience that you get. So yeah, as an English major, I didn't predict where I'd end up right now. So
that's right. You can't hide a Holy Cross education, as I've told many a Holy Cross graduate over the years. So.
Any other questions? We don't have to necessarily wrap up. Or Chris, you had?
I just wanted to make two quick comments. One is, I don't want the younger generation to feel that it's their fault. It's an intergenerational problem, and I, as a father and grandfather, feel exceptionally committed to this, because I want my children, and I want my little 1-year-old and other grandchildren that are on the way, to inherit a world that's actually better in my world. And the thing that worries me for this generation is, when I was growing up and I was raised, the world was going to be better. Like, every generation that has preceded you assumed that the world would be a better place. There would be less poverty, more wealth, better food distribution, and less war. And if you read Nicholas Kristof and a number of Daniel, it's true. And I don't want you guys to believe that you're going to inherit a worse world, and how can we all pull together to do that? The second comment I want to say is, I appreciate the professor's sense, although you followed this up very well with the MIT labs and things. I have a son who's a little bit associated with that. That you need moral outrage against capitalism. Like, capitalism is the enemy, and unless we have moral outrage against capitalism, we're something. I actually think we are on the cusp of another industrial revolution or technological revolution, and we can either use the market mechanism to help solve this problem, instead of saying the market mechanism is what got us into this problem and therefore it's broken, and so what we really need is moral outrage and another way to solve this. Money is flowing to sustainable energy. And if you guys want to make a lot of money and solve problems, get involved with that.
Yeah.
I mean, it's just flowing. I was just listening to a venture capitalist talking about this. And these guys do not even know how to say, they have so much money coming at them. They're like, we just don't even know this right. So I'd like to say, let's use the best of capitalism to solve some of our problems.
But can I comment on your first?
Of course you can, Professor. You've been involved in this way longer.
No, but that's a great points, and I completely agree with your capitalism point. On your first point on the world has always been better. And I've read Steven Pinker and all that, and in some ways the world has always been more and more degraded in some ways. Biodiversity is the prime example. So there's this beautiful book, J.B. McKinnon, that's called The Once and Future World. And it did pretty well. It's well read, but I do find that people don't know this book. Absolutely beautiful book, because what he does, he actually has gone through a whole bunch of different archives, and he accounts for, and then he writes the accounts of, in the 15th century, the 16th century, 17th century, of what the biodiversity was like in different parts of the world, and it was astounding. It was just, what we consider to be natural when you go to the West is so artificial. It's so degraded. And the phrase he didn't coin, someone else, I don't remember who coined, is we as a species are prone to shifting baseline syndrome. And this is that the baseline, what's normal, shifts. Every generation, you grow up, wherever you grow up, and that's normal. That's the new normal. But actually, it's degraded from the previous generation in terms of biodiversity. And that shifting baseline syndrome is kind of a coping mechanism for humans that we, if it's normal, then you kind of live and it's okay and all that. But there are some things, not everything, like wealth and reducing poverty and literacy, absolutely. But on some things like biodiversity, I did want to mention biodiversity during this, because the other major tragedy accompanying climate change, and very closely related, is the loss of biodiversity. And it's something also that I would hope that all of you would consider to be just as important as climate change. Obviously really, really closely related, but there's some ways in which biodiversity loss happens that are completely independent of climate change. Like, did you know that the primary pressure on the most endangered species is actually illegal trafficking? Is people actually going and grabbing the animal and illegally it's horrible. It's a horrible thing. And so those things, that we actually need to make a lot of progress on. And I do hope that this generation really, my generation as well, but this generation really takes it up. And I totally agree with you on the capitalism point.
My follow-up to what you were talking about in policies, but do you see the role of a higher institution like Holy Cross having this effort? Like Professor Harvey has his research on food systems, and we have research about like water systems.
Yeah.
Professor Mitchell with measuring microplastics and all of that. But how do you see like student involvement as a part of larger movements?
Yeah. So there's lots of. So I'll put this in the Worcester context as well. There's lots and lots of things that the university could do to help you be involved and engage with other students at other universities. For example, I would, putting it in the Worcester concept, that's kind of like learning by doing, and how to really make things, how to change things, because then you can contribute to the Worcester Green Plan and wherever you live in the future. So that's really, really important. But this is, I'll be very quick. I'm in the middle of making an argument with colleagues at MIT that MIT needs to shift its mission further away from the typical academic activities. And so the metrics of tenure and all that need to be shifted away from the typical paper writing and books and all that. It needs to be solutions oriented. We actually have to measure ourselves year in, year out on have we actually contributed to the major global challenges, and like to be really cold-eyed about that, to say, well, have we actually contributed? Because part of the problem with academia today is that, understandably, people from the outside are looking in and saying, boy, you guys are privileged. And are you really doing anything, right? So I think that, for me, that's a really important thing. Holy Cross is no less able to contribute because of the social sciences and liberal arts and all that than MIT. And so I would think, so it's this kind of larger mission movement. It does take a coalition of people from the community, students, faculty, staff, and definitely faculty. The faculty have to be behind it to really shift the mission of a university. But it's ongoing at MIT, and there are some things that are telling me that it is happening and will happen in a big way pretty soon. So that's what I would advocate for. Sorry, you have a question?
Speaking of privilege, what are some of the things we can look at if, our local area is like a community without large obvious problems?
What are the things that you can what?
Like what are some of the things that we can, what are some of the things that might be problems in communities even we don't see big obvious problem there.
That you can contribute to solving?
Yeah.
So stop eating meat. That's a huge one. I mean, that's one. Bike, reduce your own carbon emissions. But don't fall into the trap of the corporate messaging that says that climate change is an individual problem. Because it's not. It's a systemic problem. I don't know if that answers your question.
Sorry, your turn, yeah.
Hi. So I was just wondering, I really appreciate you pointing out that the Green Worcester plan is a great model for future communities. I'm really curious about what models that you use to draft the Green Worcester plan, and if you could speak a little bit more to the political pressures that might have occurred during the process of drafting the Green Worcester plan, getting it passed and whatnot. But moreover, I would love to hear what sort of different cities, different countries, and different international agreements that might have shaped your decision on how to phrase things.
I'd almost gotten you off the hook of all those political pressures and the people that fought
close.
back. So, yeah.
So very close. No, it's a great question and really an important one. So, there were a lot of steps that we took in terms of, and we totally riffed off other successful plans too. John is absolutely right when he made the point that, part of the benefit of people writing these plans is that you can look at others, steal what you think makes them, borrow the things that you think are most important to your community, tweak them, improve them for your community, and then incorporate it into them. And so we definitely did that. We had a great consultant too. That's another very important thing, is to get someone who's good and don't use the standard city protocol of low price wins. Is you gotta do for communities, it's a request for qualifications as opposed for an RFP, request for proposals. It just shifts the dynamic where the actual qualifications of the folks have much more weight than just the price. Price still has a lot of weight, but it's only one of the factors. So a great consultant was key, and we got a really good one with Larissa Brown and Associates, for the record. She was very good, and her team. But I think and this has come up a couple times, a few things, is that about a little bit of more than a year prior to when we started putting together the Green Worcester plan, the climate emergency was passed for the city, and that was directly the result of grassroots organizations insisting that the council be on record to say that they care about climate change and what Worcester's going to do about it in our little part of the world. And that was the impetus, I think, that gave, once they committed to that, then when we wrote the Green Worcester plan, a lot of the roadblocks that normally come up with when you put together a big plan like this for a community sort of shifted. Because again, what it did, and was super effective, because we didn't have to do virtually any of it, was it shifted that the people who were for it on the council had the courage to speak for it, and the people who might have resisted, shut up. And that was great, so that we didn't get nearly as much resistance in the should we do it. The resistance, if anything, we got is what we should include and focus on. And our manager, give him a lot of credit. He was the one who sort of really wanted to push this forward in the first place. And he gave us a fairly wide license to do what we thought was best once he heard that we were going to engage the community as best as we could, given our resources, so that this would be a holistic kind of plan. And he was like, bring it on. I want to look at it before it goes public, but otherwise, let me see what you got. And so that was really, I guess, in a nutshell, sort of how it came to be.
Would you care to name the quietest voice in the room if it was changed? Would be a big move to a stronger.
Yeah. Well, I think it was two things. I think I would answer that is a couple people on the council who were on the outside looking in are now on the council, who advocated for this stuff and used this as a platform for getting themselves elected, one of several, but this was a primary one for them. And a couple people who I thought were shoo-ins didn't make the cut. And they, not because they were so much opposed to it, but because they didn't advocate for it. And people are finally paying attention to this, and so I think it's a real potential winner for folks if they just have the courage to move forward and talk about it, because it's hard to deny when you see it in the news constantly about one disaster after another about its importance. So I don't want to name specific counselors' names in a public setting, a recorded setting, so I have politics affects my life too, so.
I should wrap up here. Maybe any takeaways you want? Any last recommendations, words, things we missed that we should have talked about that you want to leave us with?
Well, I really enjoyed, again, like I said, being in front of Holy Cross students, and really, really hope that you don't think that by way of your, that different disciplines have, different abilities to contribute. Every single thing that you learn and every discipline is going to have a role, and as I said before, it's really up to you whether you decide to engage or not. But don't think that you're in a discipline that can't engage. But thank you so much for your time.
I'll add to John's comment just that the other thing is to think of it as broadly as you can. There's ways to contribute professionally and there's ways to contribute personally, and some of those ways will only unfold in the relationships that you have with people. So on some of, I work in the city, I advocate in the city, but then I have, I've been able to pull together people from different, that I meet through the kids' schools or through community organizations. And so there's a lot of different ways that you can plug in and find a way to have a voice.
Yeah, no, and I, just to speak to what Karin just says is, Karin is one of the advocates that we hear from often and has had measurable impact, she and her team, on the WalkBike Worcester in particular, but also just as a person who helped on the, writing the Green Worcester plan with some great insights, and she was fantastic. And it's that kind of opportunity that I think everyone in this room could potentially have if you're willing and able. And I know it's a privilege if you can do it, but if you can and are so willing, it really does make an impact. I mean, Karin is a living example of how my new position came to be, because it was advocated for in the plan of which she was a participant. So, I mean, it all connects.
Interestingly, our sustainability office came to be because our students advocated to make that happen as well. So
there you go.
Next generation of students can push in different ways. So thank you all very much.
Thank you, Tom.
People